free as a bird in the air, sweet as a breeze through your hair, wild as the waves on the sea. That's how you'll remain in my memory. The moon was high below the equator, and you and I were so in love. The sea was blue below the equator. Our dreams were new, and so was love. We strolled where the Andes kissed the sky, through palms filled with silk and moss. Was there that we cried and kissed goodbye by the light of the Southern Cross? My heart will stay below the equator until the day we meet again. We strolled where the Andes kiss the sky, through palms filled with silk and moss. Was there that we cried and kissed goodbye by the light of the Southern Cross? My heart will stay below the equator until the day we meet again.
All right, Brobs. We're back with The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. Let me open this chat. Turn off the little space heater. Get to reading. Something in Harriet snapped to.
Something in Harriet.
Whoa, whoa.
Something in Harriet. Whoa.
Come on. Got some feedback. Always got to remember to turn down the volume. Something in Harriet snapped to, and she found herself in her body again, lying on her side, and it was like returning to a window that she'd walked away from, but to a different pain. Her hand was bloody. For a moment she stared at it without quite knowing what it was. Then she remembered and sat up with a bolt. He was coming, not a moment to waste. She stood groggily. Suddenly a hand shot out from behind and seized hold of her ankle, and she screamed and kicked at it and, unexpectedly, broke free. She lunged for the trapdoor just as Danny Ratliff's battered face and blood-spattered shirt rose up behind her on the ladder, like a swimmer climbing from a pool. He was scary, smelly, huge. Harriet, gasping, practically weeping with terror, clattered down towards the water. His shadow fell across the open trapdoor, blocking out the sun. Clang, ugly motorcycle boots stepped on the ladder overhead. Down he came after her. Clang, clang, clang. Harriet turned and threw herself off the ladder. She hit the water feet first. Down she plunged into the dark and cold, down into her feet, struck bottom. Sputtering, gagging from the filthy taste, she pulled back her arms and shot up to the surface in a mighty breaststroke. But just as she broke the surface, a strong hand closed fast on her wrist and hauled her up out of the water. He was chest deep in the water, holding on to the ladder and leaning out sideways to grasp her by the arm, and his silvery eyes, glowing light and powerful in his sunburnt face, pierced her like a stab. It is The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. The Little Friend. Flailing, twisting, fighting as hard as it was possible for her to fight, and with a strength she'd never known she had before, Harriet struggled to get away, but though she raised the tremendous spray of water, it was no use. Up he hauled her. Her waterlogged clothes were heavy. She could feel his muscles trembling from the strain as Harriet kicked fan after fan of nasty water up into his face. "Who you?" he shouted. His lip was split, his cheeks greasy and unshaven. "What you want with me?" Harriet let out a strangled gasp. The pain in her shoulder was breathtaking. On his bicep squirmed a blue tattoo, murky octopus shape, a blurred Old English script, illegible. "What are you doing up here? Speak up!" He shook Harriet by the arm until the scream burst unwilling from her throat, and she kicked around desperately in the water for something to brace herself on. In a flash, he pinned her leg with his knee, and with a high, womanish cackle, caught her up by the hair of the head. Swiftly, he pushed her face down into the filthy water and then hauled her up again, dripping. He was trembling all over. "Now answer me, you little bitch," he screamed. In truth, Danny trembled as much from shock as anger. He'd acted so fast he hadn't had time to think, and even though the girl was in his grasp, he could hardly believe it. The girl's nose was bloody. Her face, rippling in the watery light, was streaked with rust and dirt. Balefully, she stared at him, all puffed up like a little barn owl. "You better start talking," he shouted, "and I mean now." His voice boomed and ricocheted crazily inside the tank. Sunbeams filtered in through the dilapidated roof, breathing and flickering heavily on the claustrophobic walls, a sickly, remote light like a mine shaft or a collapsed well. Yeah, there's some violence in there. In the dimness, the girl's face floated above the water like a white moon. He became aware of the fast, small noise of her breaths. "Answer me," he screamed. "What the hell are you doing up here?" And he shook her again as hard as he could, leaning out over the water and holding tight to the ladder with his other hand. Shook her by the neck until a scream burst forth from her throat. And, as tired and frightened as he was, a surge of anger twisted through him, and he roared over her cries so ferociously that her face went blank, and the cries died upon her lips. His head hurt. Think, he told himself, think. He had her, all right, but what to do with her? He was in a tricky position. Danny had always told himself he could dog paddle in a pinch, but now, chest deep in water, hanging on to the flimsy ladder, he wasn't so sure. How hard could it be swimming? Cows could swim, even cats. Why not him? He became aware of the kid, craftily trying to ease out of his grip. Sharply, he caught her up again, digging his fingers deep into the flesh of her neck so that she yelped out. "Listen here, prissy," he said. "You speak up right quick and tell me who you are, and maybe I won't drown you." It was a lie, and it sounded like a lie. From her ashy face, he could tell that she knew that, too. It made him feel bad because she was just a kid, but there wasn't any other way. "I'll let you go," he said, convincingly, he thought. To his annoyance, the girl puffed out her cheeks and settled down into herself even further. He jerked her into the light so that he could see her better, and a beam of sunlight fell across her white forehead in a clammy streak. Warm as it was, she looked half frozen. He could practically hear her teeth clacking. Again he shook her so hard his shoulder hurt. But though the tears streamed down her face, her lips were clamped tight, and she didn't make a sound. Then suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Danny caught sight of something pale floating in the water. Little white blobs, 2 or 3 of them, half sunk and washing in the water near his chest. He drew back. "Frog eggs?" And the next instant screamed, a scream that astonished him, that boiled up high and scalding from his very bowels. Submission? She's a kid and he's trying to kill her. Jesus Christ, he stared at what he was seeing, unable to believe it, and then up at the top of the ladder at the shreds of black plastic hanging in ribbons from the top rung. It was a nightmare. It wasn't real. The drugs spoiled. His fortune gone. Ferris dead for nothing. Murder won if they caught him. Jesus, you done this? You? The kid's lips moved. Danny spotted a waterlogged bubble of black plastic floating on the water, and a howl broke from his throat like he'd stuck his hand in the fire. What's this? What's this? He screamed, forcing her head to the water. Strangled reply, the first word she'd spoken, a garbage bag. What you done to it, huh? Huh? The hand tightened on Harriet's neck. Down, quick. He plunged her head to the water. Harriet had just enough time to breathe, horrified, eyes starting at the dark water, before he pushed her under. Bubbles charged white before her face. Soundlessly she fought, amidst phosphorescence, pistol shots and echoes. In her mind she saw a locked suitcase clatter along a riverbed, thump, 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 swept by the current, rolling end over and over smooth, mucky stones. In Harriet's heart was a struck piano key, the same deep note, thump sharp and urgent, as a vision like scratched sulfur flared behind her closed eyelids, a white Lucifer streak leaping in the dark. Pain tore through Harriet's scalp as splash. Up he jerked her, up by the roots of the hair. She was deafened by coughs. The din and echo overwhelmed her. He was shouting words she couldn't understand, and his face was stony red, swollen with rage and fearful to see. Retching, choking, she beat the water with her arms and kicked out for something to brace herself against. And when her toe struck the wall of the tank, she drew a full, satisfying breath. The relief was heavenly, indescribable, magical chord, harmony of the spears. In she breathed, in and in, until he shrieked and pushed her head down, and the water crashed in her ears again. Ah! Danny gritted his teeth and held on. Fat ropes of pain twisted deep in his shoulders, and the screeching and bouncing of the ladder had broken him out in a sweat. Against his hand, her head bobbed light and unstable, a balloon that might slide from beneath his hand at any moment, and the kicking and churning of her body made him seasick. No matter how he tried to brace himself or settle into his position, he couldn't get comfortable. Dangling off the ladder with nothing solid under him, he kept kicking his legs around in the water and trying to step on something that wasn't there. How long did it take to drown somebody? It was an ugly job, and twice as ugly if you were doing it with only one arm. A mosquito whined infuriatingly around his ear. He'd been jerking his head from side to side, trying to avoid it, but it seemed to sense, the fucker, that his hands weren't free to swat it. Mosquitoes everywhere, everywhere. They'd finally found him, and they understood he wasn't moving. Maddeningly, luxuriously, the stingers sank into his chin, his neck, the trembling flesh of his arms. Come on, just get it over with, he told himself. He was holding her down with the right hand, the stronger hand, but his eyes were fixed on the hand that gripped the ladder. He'd lost a lot of the feeling in it, and the only way he could be sure he was still holding on was by staring at his fingers, wrapped tight around the rung. Besides, the water frightened him, and if he looked at it, he was afraid he would black out. A drowning kid could pull down a grown man, a trained swimmer, a lifeguard. He'd heard those stories. This is the Bible. All at once, he realized she stopped struggling. For a moment, he was quiet, waiting. Her head was soft beneath his palm. He let up a little, then turning to look because he had to, but not really wanting to look, he was relieved to see her form washing limply in the green water. Cautiously, he eased up the pressure. She didn't move. Pins and needles showered down his aching arms, and he swung around on the ladder, swapping his grip and swatting the mosquitoes out of his face as he did so. For a while longer, he looked at her indirectly, from the tail of his eye, as if some accident on the highway. All of a sudden, his arms started shaking so hard that he could scarcely hold on to the ladder. With a forearm, he wiped the sweat from his face, spit out a mouthful of something sour, then, trembling all over, he grasped the rung above and straightened both elbows and hoisted himself up, the rusted iron squealing loudly beneath him. As tired as he was, as badly as he wanted to get away from the water, he forced himself to turn back and give her body one long last stare. Then he prodded her with his foot and watched her spin away, as inert as any log, off into the shadows. Harriet had stopped being scared. Something strange had taken her over. Chains snapped, locks broke, gravity rolled away. Up she floated, up and up, suspended in airless night, arms out, an astronaut, weightless. Darkness trembling in her wake. Interleaked circlets, swelling and expanding like raindrop rings on water. Grandeur and strangeness, her ears buzzed, she could almost feel the sun, beating hot across her back as she soared above ashy plains, vast desolations. I know what it feels like to die. If she opened her eyes, it would be to her own shadow, arms spread, a Christmas angel shimmering blue on the floor of the swimming pool. The water lapped the underside of Harriet's body, and the roll approximated soothingly the rhythm of breath. It was as if the water outside her body were doing the breathing for her. Breath itself was a forgotten song, a song that angels sang. Breath in, accord. Breath out, exultation, triumph, the lost choirs of paradise. She'd been holding her breath for a long time. She could keep on holding it for just a little longer. It's Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. A little longer, a little longer. Suddenly, a foot pushed Harriet's shoulder, and she felt herself spinning. To the dark side of the tank, gentle shower of sparks. On she sailed in the cold, twinkle, twinkle. Shooting stars, lights far below, cities sparkling in the dark atmosphere. An urgent pain burned in her lungs, stronger every second, but a little longer, she told herself, just a little longer. Must fight it out to the last. Her head bumped the opposite wall of the tank. The force rolled her back, and in the same moment, the same backwards wash, her head bobbed just enough for her to sneak the tiniest split-second breath before she sloshed face down again. Darkness again, a darker darkness. If that was possible, draining the last glimmer of light from her eyes. Harriet hung in the water and waited, her clothes washing gently about her. She was on the sunless side of the tank near the wall. The shadow, she hoped, and the motion of the water had camouflaged the breath. Only the tiniest breath. At the very top of her lungs, it hadn't been enough to relieve the terrible pain in her chest, but it was enough to keep her going a little longer. A little longer. Somewhere a stopwatch was ticking, for it was only a game, and a game she was good at. Birds can sing and fish can swim, and I can do this. Sparkly needle pricks like icy raindrops pattered over her scalp and the back of her arms. Hot concrete and chlorine smells. Striped beach balls and kiddie floats. I'll stand in line to get a frozen Snickers bar or maybe a dreamsicle. A little longer, deeper she sank, down into airlessness, her lungs glowing bright with pain. She was a small white moon, floating high over trackless deserts. Danny clung to the ladder, breathing hard. The ordeal of drowning the kid had made him forget, temporarily, about the drugs, but now the reality of his situation had sunk in on him again, and he wanted to claw his face, to wail aloud. How the fuck was he going to get out of town with a blood-spattered car and no money? He'd been counting on the crystal meth, on moving that in bars or on street corners if he had to. He had maybe $40 on him that had considered that driving over couldn't very well pay the man at the Texaco with methamphetamine. And there was also the best friend of Farish's, that bill-stuffed wallet Farish always kept in his hip pocket. Farish liked to pull it out sometimes and flash it around at the poker table or at the pool hall. But how much money was actually in it? Danny didn't know. If he was lucky, really lucky, maybe as much as $1,000. She didn't drown. She practiced holding her breath all summer, so she's not really drowned. as you could tell by the fact that she was floating and holding her breath still. So there was Ferris's jewelry. The iron cross wasn't worth anything, but the rings were, and the wallet. Danny passed a hand over his face. The money in the wallet would keep him going for a month or two, but after that, maybe he could get a fake ID, or maybe he could get a job where he wouldn't need one, doing migrant work, picking oranges or tobacco. But it was a poor reward, a poor future next to the jackpot he'd expected. And when they found the body, they'd be looking for him. The gun lay in the weeds, wiped clean, mafia style. The smart thing to do would be to dump it in the river. But now that the drugs were gone, the gun was one of his only remaining assets. The more he thought about his choices, the fewer and shittier they seemed. He looked at the shape, sloshing in the water. Why had she destroyed his drugs? Why? He was superstitious about the kid. She was a shadow and a jinx, but now that she was dead, he feared that maybe she'd been his good luck charm, too. For all he knew, he'd made a huge mistake, the mistake of his life, by killing her. But so help me, he said to her form in the water, and couldn't finish the sentence. From that first moment outside the pool hall, he'd been caught up with her somehow, in something that he didn't understand, and the mystery of it still pressed in on him. If he'd had her on dry ground, he would have knocked it out of her, but it was too late for that now. He fished one of the packets of speed out of the nasty water. It was stuck together and melted, but maybe, if cooked down, shootable. Fishing around, he came up with half a dozen more or less waterlogged bags. He'd never shot drugs, but why not start? One last look, and he started up the ladder. The rungs, rusted nearly through, shrieked and buckled under his weight. He could feel movement in the thing. It was wobbling under him, a whole lot more than he liked, and he was grateful to emerge at last from the closed dankness into the brightness and heat. On shaky legs, he climbed to his feet. He was sore all over, a muscular soreness, as if he'd been beaten, which, come to think of it, he had been. A storm was rolling in over the river. To the east, the sky was sunny and blue. To the west, gunmetal black with thunderclouds rolling and surging in over the river. Shady spots sailed over the low roofs of the town. Danny stretched, rubbed the small of his back. He was sodden, dripping. Long strands of green slime clung to his arms, and in spite of everything, his spirits had lifted absurdly, just to be out of the dark and damp. The air was humid, but there was a little breeze, and he could breathe again. He stepped across the roof to the edge of the tank, and his knees went watery with relief. When off in the distance, he saw the car, undisturbed, a single set of tracks, winding through the tall weeds behind it. Gladly, without thinking, he started to the ladder, but he was a little off balance, and before he knew what was happening, crack! His foot was through a rotten plank. Suddenly, the world pitched sideways, diagonal slash of gray boards, blue sky. For a wild moment, arms windmilling, he flailed to recover his balance, but there was an answering crack, and he fell through the boards to the waist. Harriet, floating face downward, was seized with a spasm of shuddering. She'd been trying stealthily to ease her head to the side so she could draw another little breath through her nose, but with no luck. Her lungs could stand no more. They buckled uncontrollably, heaving for air, and if not air, then water. And just as her mouth opened of its own accord, she broke the surface with a shudder and inhaled deep, deep, deep. The relief was so great it nearly sank her. Clumsily, with one hand, she braced herself against the slimy wall and gasped, and gasped, and gasped. Air delicious, air pure and profound. Air pouring through her body like song. She didn't know where Danny Ratliff was. She didn't know if he was watching, and she didn't care. Breathing was all that mattered anymore. And if this was the last breath of her life, so be it. From overhead, a loud crack. Though Harriet first thought was the pistol, she made no move to get away. Let him shoot me, she thought, gasping, eyes damp with gratitude. Anything was better than drowning. Then a slash of sunlight struck bright green and velvety on the dark water, and Harriet looked up just in time to see a pair of legs waggling through a hole in the roof. Snap went the plank. As the water rushed toward him, Danny was gripped with a sickness of fear. In a confused flash, his father's warning from long ago came back to hold his breath and keep his mouth shut. Then the water slammed into his ears and he was screaming, a closed-off scream, staring out horrified into the green darkness. Down he plunged, then miraculously his feet struck bottom. Danny jumped, clawing, sputtering, climbing up through the water, and broke through the surface of the water like a torpedo. At the height of the jump, he had just enough time to gulp a breath of air before slipping under again. Murk and silence, the water, it seemed, was only about a foot over his head. Above him, the surface shone bright green, and again he jumped from the bottom, layers of green that grew paler and paler as he rose, and broke back through into light with a crash. It seemed to work better if he kept his arms to his sides and didn't beat them around like swimmers were supposed to. Between jumps and breaths, he oriented himself. The tank was awash in sun. Light streamed in through the collapsed section of the roof. The slimy green walls were lurid, ghastly. After 2 or 3 jumps, he caught sight of the ladder off to his left. Could he make it? He wondered as the water closed over his head. If he jumped toward it gradually, why not? He would have to try for it. It was the best he could do. He broke the surface, then, with a painful shock, so sharp that he breathed in at the wrong time, he saw the kid. She was clinging with both hands to the bottom rung of the ladder. Was he seeing things? He wondered on the way down, coughing, bubbles streaming past his eyes, for the face had struck him oddly. For a weird moment, it hadn't been the kid at all he was looking at, but the old lady, E. Cleve. Choking, gasping, he burst through the water again. No doubt about it. It was the kid, and she was still alive, half drowned and pinched looking, eyes dark in a sickly white face. The after image glowed round behind Danny's eyelids as he sank into the dark water. Up he jumped explosively. The girl was struggling now, grappling, swinging a knee up, pulling herself up on the ladder. In a burst of spray, he swiped for her ankle and missed, and the water closed over his head. On his next jump, he caught the bottom rung, which was rusted and slippery, and it slid right through his fingers. Up he jumped again, grabbing for it with both hands, and this time got a grip on it. She was above him on the ladder, scrambling up ahead of him like a monkey. Water streamed off her and into his upturned face. With an energy born of rage, Danny hoisted himself up, the rusted metal shrieking beneath his weight like a living creature. Directly above, a rung buckled under the kid's sneaker. He saw her falter, grabbed the side rail as her foot struck empty air. It won't hold her, he thought, in astonishment, watching her catch herself, right herself, swinging a leg to the top of the tank now. If it won't hold her, it won't hold. The bar snapped in Danny's face, or fists. The bar snapped in Danny's fist. In a single, swift, slicing movement, little brittle stems stripped from a branch. Down to the ladder he fell, down to the rust-corroded rungs, and back into the tank. With rust-reddened hands, Harriet pulled herself up and fell forward, gasping onto the hot boards. Thunder rumbled in the deep blue distance. The sun had gone under a cloud, and the restless breeze tossing in the treetops set her shivering. Between herself and the ladder, the roof was partially caved in, sprung boards slanting downward to an enormous hole. Her breath rasped noisily and uncontrollable, a panicky sound that made her feel sick just to hear it. And as she rose to her hands and knees, a sharp pain grabbed her in the side. Then from inside the tank burst a flurry of agitated splashing. She dropped to her stomach, breathing raggedly. She began to scramble around the collapsed portion of the roof, and her heart clenched as the boards sank sharply under her weight and groaned precariously toward the water. Back and away she scrambled, panting, just in time as part of a board snapped off into the water. Then, up through the hole, high in the air, spattered a startling fan of water, flung drops striking her face and arms. A strangled howl, wet and burbling, spouted violently from below, stiff now, practically waxen with terror. Harriet inched forward on her hands and knees. Though looking down into the hole made her dizzy, she couldn't help herself. Daylight flooded in through the broken roof. The inside of the tank glowed a lush emerald green, the green of swamps and jungles, of Mowgli's abandoned cities. The grass-green blanket of algae had broken up like pack ice, black veins crackling the opaque surface of the water. Then splash, up burst Danny Ratliff, white-faced and gasping, hair plastered dark on his forehead. His hand grappled and groped, grasping for the ladder, but there wasn't any more ladder. Harriet saw, blinking down at the green water. It had broken off about 5 feet above the surface, too high for him to reach. As she watched in horror, the hand sank into the water, the last part of him to vanish, broken fingernails clutching at the air. Then up bobbed his head, not quite high enough, eyelids fluttering, an ugly wet gurgle in his breath. He could see her, up top. He was trying to say something, like a wingless bird. He guttered and struggled in the water, and his struggles gave her a feeling that she could not name. The words broke from his mouth in an indistinct burble as he slipped under, flailing, and was gone. Nothing of him visible but a weedy tuft of hair, bubbles foaming white at the slimy surface. All quiet, bubbles boiling. Up he burst again, his face melted, looking somehow, his mouth a black hole. He was clutching at some floating boards, but they wouldn't hold his weight. And as he crashed back into the water, his wide eyes met hers. Accusatory, helpless, the eyes of a guillotined head held up before a mob. His mouth worked. He tried to speak some glubbing, gasping, incomprehensible word that was swallowed as he sank. A strong wind blew, raising goosebumps on Harriet's arms, shivering the leaves on all the trees, and all at once, in a single breath, the sky darkened to slate gray. Then, in a long, sweeping gust, raindrops rattled across the roof like a shower of pebbles. It was a warm, drenching, tropical-feeling rain, a squall like the ones that blew in on the Gulf Coast during hurricane season. It clattered loudly on the broken roof, but not so loudly that the gurgles and splashing from below were dimmed out. Raindrops leaped like little silver fish on the surface of the water. Harriet was seized by a fit of coughing. The water had gone in her mouth and up her nose, and the rotten taste soaked her to her marrow. Now, with the rain driving in her face, she spat on the boards, turned on her back, and rolled her head to and fro, driven nearly mad with the wretched noise that was echoing up the tank. A noise, it occurred to her, that probably was not much different from the noises that Robin had made as he was strangling to death. She'd imagined it happening clean and quick, no floundering or ugly wet strangles. Only clapped hands and a puff of smoke, and the sweetness of the thought struck her. How lovely to vanish off the face of the earth. What a sweet dream to vanish now. Out of her body, poof, like a spirit, chains clattering empty to the floor. Steam rose from the hot, verdant ground. Far below, in the weeds, the Trans Am was hunched in a disturbing, confidential stillness. Raindrops shimmering on the hood in a fine white mist. A couple might have been inside it kissing. Often in the years to come, she would see it just so, blind, intimate, unreflecting, off in the thin, speechless margins of her dreams. It was 2:00 when Harriet, after pausing to listen, all clear, let herself in through the back door. Apart from Mr. Godfrey, who didn't seem to have recognized her, and Mrs. Fountain, who had given her an exceedingly strange look from the porch, dirty as she was, striped with black filaments of slime that had stuck to her skin and banked on in the heat. She had encountered no one. Cautiously, after looking both ways, she scurried down the hall to the downstairs bathroom and bolted the door behind her. The taste of decay fumed and smoldered in her mouth. Unendurable. She stripped off her clothes. The smell was horrific. The Girl Scout shirt coming over her head made her gag, and threw them into the bathtub and turned the faucets on them. Edie often told the story about the time she almost died from an oyster at a New Orleans wedding. Sickest I've ever been. She'd known the oyster was bad, she said, the moment she'd been into it. She'd spit it right out in her napkin, but within hours collapsed and had to be taken to Baptist Hospital. In much the same way, from the instant she tasted the water in the tank, Harriet had known it was going to make her sick. The rottenness had seeped into her flesh. Nothing would wash it away. She rinsed her hands and mouth. She gargled with Listerine and spat it out, cupped her hands under the cold tap and drank and drank and drank. But the smell permeated everything, even the clean water. It rose from the dirty clothes in the bathtub. It rose ripe and warm from the pores of her skin. Harriet dumped half a box of Mr. Bubble into the tub and ran the hot water until the foam churned up outrageously. But even under the numbing mouthwash, the taste lingered, ugly like a stain on Harriet's tongue, and it called up vividly and quite particularly the bloated creature half sunk and bobbing against the dark wall of the tank. A knock at the door. Harriet called her mother. "Is that you?" Harriet never took baths in the downstairs bathroom. "Yes, ma'am," called Harriet after an instant over the pounding water. "Are you making a mess in there?" "No, ma'am," called Harriet, looking bleakly at the mess. "You know I don't like you to bathe in that bathroom." Harriet couldn't answer. A wave of cramps had gripped her. Sitting on the side of the tub, staring at the bolted door, she clamped both hands over her mouth and rocked back and forth. "There better not be a mess in there," her mother called. The water Harriet had drunk from the tap was coming right back up. With one eye on the door, she got out of the bathtub and, doubled over by the pain in her abdomen, she tiptoed to the commode as quietly as she could. As soon as she removed her hands from her mouth, out it poured, whoosh, a clear, startling gush of putrid water that smelled exactly like the stagnant water Danny Ratliff had drowned in. In the bath, Harriet drank more water from the cold tap, washed her clothes, and washed herself. She drained the tub, she scrubbed it with Comet, she rinsed out the slime and grit, and climbed in again to rinse herself. But the dark odor of decay had soaked her through and through, so that even after all the soap and water, she still felt pickled and drenched in foulness, discolored, wretched, hanging her head with it. Like an oil-soaked penguin she'd seen in a National Geographic magazine, over at Edie's house, standing miserably in a wash pail, holding its little greasy flippers out to the side to keep them from touching its befouled body. Harriet drained the tub again and scrubbed it. She wrung out her dripping clothes and hung them to dry. She sprayed Lysol. She sprayed herself with a dusty bottle of green cologne that had a flamenco dancer on the label. She was clean and pink now, dizzy with the heat. Just beneath the perfume, the moisture in the steamy bathroom was still heavy with the suggestion of rot, the same ripe flavor that lay heavy on her tongue. More mouthwash, she thought, and without warning, another noisome spout of clear vomit came up, pouring out of her mouth in a ridiculous flood. When it was over, Harriet lay on the cold floor, cheek against sea-green tile. As soon as she was able to stand, she dragged herself to the sink and cleaned up with a dish wash rag. Then she wrapped herself in a towel and crept upstairs to her room. She was so sick, so giddy and tired that before she'd realized what she'd done, she'd pulled down the covers and climbed into bed, the bed she hadn't slept in for weeks. But it felt so heavenly that she didn't care, and despite the gripping pains in her stomach, she fell into heavy sleep. She was awakened by her mother. It was twilight. Harriet's stomach ached, and her eyes felt scratchy like when she'd had the pink eye. "What?" she said, raising herself heavily on her elbows. "I said, are you sick?" "I don't know." Harriet's mother bent close to feel her forehead, then knitted her eyebrows and drew back. "What's that smell?" When Harriet didn't answer, she leaned forward and sniffed her neck suspiciously. "Did you put on some of that green cologne?" she said. "No, ma'am. Lying a habit now. Best now, when in doubt, always to say no." That stuff's no good. Harriet's father had given it to Harriet's mother for Christmas. The lime green perfume with the flamenco dancer. It had sat on the shelf unused for years, a fixture of Harriet's childhood. If you want some perfume, I'll get you a little bottle of Chanel No. 5 at the drugstore, or Norel. That's what Mother wears. I don't care for Norel myself. It's a little strong. Harriet closed her eyes. Sitting up made her feel sick to her stomach all over again. Scarcely had she laid her head on the pillow than her mother was back again, this time with a glass of water and an aspirin. Maybe you'd better have a can of broth, she said. I'll call Mother and see if she has any. While she was gone, Harriet climbed out of bed and, wrapping herself in the scratchy crochet afghan, trailed down the hall to the bathroom. The floor was cold, and so was the toilet seat. Vomit, a little, gave way to diarrhea, a lot. Washing up at the sink afterwards, she was shocked to see in the medicine cabinet mirror how red her eyes were. Shivering, she crept back to her bed. Though the covers were heavy on her limbs, they didn't feel very warm. Then her mother was shaking down the thermometer. Here, she said, open your mouth, and she stuck it in. Harriet lay looking at the ceiling. Her stomach boiled. The swampy taste of the water still haunted her. She fell into a dream where a nurse who looked like Mrs. Dorier from the health service was explaining to her that she'd been bitten by a poisonous spider and that a blood transfusion would save her life. It was me, Harriet said. I killed him. Mrs. Dorier and some other people were setting up equipment for the transfusion. Someone said, she's ready now. It said, leave me alone. All right, said Mrs. Dorier, and left. Harriet was uneasy. There were some other ladies lingering around, smiling at Harriet and whispering, but none of them offered any help or questioned Harriet about her decision to die, even though she slightly wanted them to. Harriet, said her mother, and with a jolt she sat up. The bedroom was dark. The thermometer was gone from her mouth. Here, Harriet's mother was saying. The meaty, smelling steam from the cup was ripe and sickening. Harriet said, smearing her hand over her face, I don't want it. Please, darling. Fretfully, Harriet's mother pushed the punch cup at her. It was ruby glass, and Harriet loved it. One afternoon, quite by surprise, Libby had taken it from her china cabinet and wrapped it up in some newspaper and given it to Harriet to take home with her, because she knew that Harriet loved it so. Now in the dim room it glowed black with one sinister ruby spark at the heart. No, said Harriet, turning her head from the cup, continually nudging at her face. No, no. Harriet, it was the old debutante Snap, thin-skinned and tetchy, a petulance that brooked no argument. There it was again, under her nose. There was nothing for Harriet to do but sit up and take it. Down she gulped it, the meaty, sickening liquid, trying not to gag. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the paper napkin that her mother offered, and then, without warning, up it came again, glub, all over the coverlet, parsley snips and everything. Harriet's mother let out a little yelp. Her crossness made her look strangely young, like a sulky babysitter on a bad night. Harriet's mother, I'm sorry, Harriet said miserably. The slop smelled like swamp water with chicken broth mixed into it. Oh, darling, what a mess. No, don't, said Charlotte with a panicky catch in her voice as Harriet, overcome with exhaustion, attempted to lie back down in the mess. Then something very strange and sudden happened. A strong light from overhead blared in Harriet's face. It was the cut glass ceiling fixture in the hall. With amazement, Harriet realized that she wasn't in her bed, or even in her bedroom, but lying on the floor in the upstairs hall in a narrow passage between some stacked newspapers. Strangest of all, Edie knelt beside her, with a grim, pale set to her face and no lipstick. Harriet, wholly disoriented, put an arm up and rolled her head from side to side, and as she did it, her mother swooped down, crying loudly. Edie flung out an arm to bar her. Let her breathe. Harriet lay on the hardwood floor, marveling. Besides the wonder of being in a different place, the first thought that struck her was that her head and neck hurt, really hurt. The second was that Edie wasn't supposed to be upstairs. Harriet couldn't even remember the last time Edie had been inside the house beyond the front hall, which was kept relatively clean for benefit of visitors. How did I get here? She asked Edie, but it didn't come out quite the way it was supposed to. Her thoughts were all jumbled and crunched together, and she swallowed and tried again. Edie shushed her. She helped Harriet to sit up, and Harriet, looking down at her arms and legs, noticed with a strange thrill that she was wearing different clothes. Why are my clothes different? She tried to ask, but that didn't come out right either. Gamely, she chewed over the sentence. Hush, said Edie, putting a finger to Harriet's lips. To Harriet's mother, weeping in the background, Allison standing behind, hunted looking, biting her finger, said, How long did it last? I don't know, said Harriet's mother, clutching her temples. Charlotte, it's important. She's had a seizure. Oh, dear. What time am I at? 45 minutes. Whoa, the bell fell. It scared the hell out of me. All right, I can go about another 5 minutes if there's not too big of a section. It's going to go for pages, so that's going to be the end. I'm not reading 5 more pages. No. All right, Brobs, that's all. That's all.